Hi, welcome back to another Conversations in History. My name is Greg Norman. We're lucky enough to have with us today Tom Graesser, who is a former Cranbrook coach and a member of the Michigan High School Lacrosse Coaches Association Hall of Fame. And Tom, we're going to talk a whole bunch about lacrosse today, and we appreciate you sitting down and talking with us. This is an interview that we've been doing with a number of Hall of Fame members, and we certainly appreciate not only your contribution to the sport, but what this conversation means to some of the folks who haven't seen you in a while. So thanks for sitting down and talking with us. And the easiest thing to do, Tom, is to start all the way back in New England. And I think you grew up in the Connecticut area, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I did.
Take us through Connecticut.
Thank you. And first, let me say too that I heartily appreciate that someone even remembers someone as old as I, just about to turn 75, and asking me to go back that far is, as I've said to many folks, my mind is a moving target. So we'll see what happens.
Okay.
So I grew up in Connecticut, went to school in Lenox, Mass. At Lenox School, and learned lacrosse there. Started as a sophomore. And I guess as an aside, I'll say that because of my time heading the Michigan Lacrosse Association, Coaches Association, the New England Lacrosse Association, Colorado, Vermont, all of the places I've been, folks like Guy Whitten in Connecticut and some others who had phenomenal programs, Wilton High School being a prime example. I think Connecticut and Michigan probably very much the same in the sense that they were not hotbeds, quote unquote, but produced and grew phenomenal programs that,
The question I was going to ask is that, Connecticut's in that between that Long Island and that, sort of Baltimore area. You get kind of caught in the middle. And I don't think Connecticut, even in those days, gets or received the kind of credit that they've turned out a lot of good lacrosse players over the years.
They have a remarkable programs and have for from my perspective, 40 plus years. And, I think the coaches that I guess didn't think that the only places in the world where lacrosse was valuable, New York and Long Island and Maryland, would, recruit kids from there and would understand that those coaches, same with Michigan, those coaches knew what they were doing, had great athletes, might not have had the same level of competition on a weekly basis, but Connecticut, I think, and Michigan are very, very similar in that regard.
What attracted you to lacrosse in the beginning?
I actually think it was my love for Native Americans. My first 3 years of teaching, I taught Native American kids from all around the country in Lenox School, boarding school. And, in the very beginning, Mort LaPointe talked me into playing. I was a lefty. That was kind of an anomaly at that point. And, the speed, et cetera. And then I started reading about the Iroquois Confederacy and the Piscataway. And, I had a Piscataway award for my programs I coached for 44 years. And probably for 34 of those, we had a Piscataway award winner. And so I think the Native American heritage and the spirit of the stick, as the book portrayed it. So,
has it occurred to you that we have a Native American sport that grew in this country as a prep sport, and there's no connection between the upper crust of prep school and Native Americans? I always thought that was an interesting. I wonder where it morphed from a historical standpoint, because you would never think that a sport that was grounded in sort of the dirt ends up at a prep school. I always found that interesting.
It's a great question. I part of my time in Michigan was we went up to Canada to play a lot of Canadian teams. I worked very hard to try and play the very best competition we could anywhere we could. And it is interesting because I've got a number of Canadian friends and I've coached some Canadian kids, and certainly with the Outlaws I did. because that's their national sport, and it's a blue collar sport. It's not as you say a prep school sport. I don't know. I have no idea. It might be because it costs money.
Yeah, I think you have to look though too. The Canadian sport being box wasn't necessarily because of Indians. It was because the rink guys that own rinks had to have something to do in the summertime to keep them filled and be able to pay for the rent in a lot of cases.
Exactly.
That's really what happened in the 20s and 30s. And that's why box developed the way it developed. So, yes, it has a connection because you're catching and passing. But I always found the connection. I'm
going to talk about that eventually when I get to my time in Michigan, because I think that actually was an inflection point for lacrosse in Michigan. But I'll get there eventually. So I went to Hobart and played under some amazing coaches. My freshman year, I played for Babe Krause, who died in a boating accident that summer, and he was the dean of lacrosse. And we couldn't play varsity as freshmen. We practiced with the freshman team with the varsity, and then played freshman games. And then sophomore year, I was coached by Buddy Beardmore, and then Jerry Schmidt, who won a number of national championships, and then went on to Princeton and was exceptional. And I always loved the fact that he was the only lacrosse player ever on the cover of Sports Illustrated. That was my coach.
That's right.
And then went back to Lennox School and started to coach. I was the assistant for Mort LaPointe, who left and went to Bowdoin College and became tremendously successful there. And coached at Lennox for a few years. Lennox closed.
Let me go backwards to Hobart a little bit.
Yeah.
Kind of talk about, Hobart's a Division I program now, but in the days you played, and probably for a long time, Division III schools in those days were as good as some of the Division I schools.
Absolutely. We played.
Talk about that as to why.
Well, in those days, there was no committee to pick the best teams in the country, Division I, Division III, Division II, et cetera. It was just, I think the Baltimore Sun and probably some newspaper in Long Island picked the best teams in the country. We played Towson, we played Maryland, we played Penn State, we played Cornell, we played Hofstra, we played all the big teams
competitively.
And we played them and won.
Yeah.
It wasn't we just played them. And we'd go down on our spring trip and play 5 games in 7 days against big dogs, a number of that would come from the north down because it was, warmer, and the Maryland teams. And it wasn't this Division I, Division III. It was just, all right, get on the field, put your shorts on, put your jersey on, and play lacrosse. It was a very, very different time.
When you were playing at Hobart, was being left-handed that much of an anomaly, or was it one of those? I've had years where I have no left-handers in the program, and I see one, and he automatically becomes a starter because he's left-handed.
Well, to be honest with you, you probably have to ask Jerry Schmidt, but I think I might have been one of two. One played midfield and one played attack. Me, and I played both. I pretty much never left the field, so I'd play attack, and when my midfield shift came on, I'd play midfield. So, and it wasn't that I was a star. Left-handed helped. It helped a whole lot, and I wasn't big. So, and it was just a different time as it morphed. I think, it's wonderful what it's become, but back in the day, it was a very different circumstance.
What'd you study at Hobart?
I was an English major. And I taught English in high school for 44 years. So
did you know at 18, 19, 20 that teaching was the vocation for you?
Yeah, I did. I think I actually knew when I was in high school. I loved my teachers in boarding school and loved that they were, Lennox School's motto was not to be served, but to serve. We did a great deal of community service, which has always been a part of my life. we, they were models. I think the whole notion of one of my favorite quotes is one from Will Rogers Jr., who said, "So lead your life that you'd not be afraid to sell your parrot to the town gossip." Fact. When you teach that way and you lead that way, I think you create leaders who are what I believe are salt of the earth, good people who make a difference in the world.
Quoting a satirist in today's world is just not something that you often hear, and I find that very very heartwarming, because the humorists of the day were also very, maybe Bill Maher in a slightly lesser capacity. There's not a lot of those who can bring some truth to the humor of that discussion. So when you're quoting those kinds of guys, that's pretty cool. I have to ask you an unrelated question.
Yes.
Having been a longtime career writer as a journalist, and that's what I retired as my career, and being grounded in the structure of English because I had a nun who wouldn't let me do anything but that. You were a teacher. You're an English teacher for 44 years. Just comment briefly on what we've lost in terms of structure within the language that the king used to speak.
All right, I'll say a couple of quick things. One, I totally, I appreciate the moment when I first started hearing from parents that kids didn't have to spell because they could learn it on the computer.
Right.
And how many years it was that I pushed that and pressed that and said, yeah, spell check works if you have a sense of what the word should be. Because I had a newspaper writer from the Denver Post show me a young writer who meant to say a placemat to their big donors, and it came out placenta. That's what was on this thing they were giving to their big donors. The other piece is, I think that our language has what I call microwaved. We just narrow it down to nothing, which takes away, I think, the glory of it. It takes away the impertinence of a good mustard. I don't know.
I say that because I have a personal interest in it. My favorite one is "my bad," and my question back to them is "my bad what?" And if they can't give me an answer to "my bad what" with a question mark at the end of it, they cost them laps. So it's really simple. I don't care if they're lazy in the game, but if they don't know my bad what, they have a problem.
Yeah. Well, that's because they don't know where it's at.
Right. Let me. We're digressing. Let me take you back to Hobart. You had a great time playing there. It was a great career.
Yes.
Where from Hobart did you go?
I went from Hobart back to Lenox to coach, and coached there. And in those days, all the prep schools played each other. We played a few. I played Long Meadow High School, which was a great public school program in Massachusetts. A few other schools. From Lenox, I went to Vermont Academy for 2 years. I try to be humble in a sense, but I only had one losing season in 44 years. And that was when I went to Vermont Academy. And they had a JV lacrosse program. And I said to the athletic director, we are going to play a varsity schedule. He said, I wouldn't do that. We were 0-14. So I did it right. When I had a losing season, I did it right. And the next year, we won 2 more than we lost. And then I went from there to Kent Denver School, or then it was Denver Country Day School in Denver. Was there for 7 years. That was a program, a circumstance very much like Michigan, in that there are not that many schools playing. Of course, being out in Denver, no one knew where Denver was.
Right.
And then I went to Michigan and got there in '79. Stayed for a decade. From the very beginning, I believe that what I tried to do was build the program and the programs in the state. I felt like, leading coaches to be better coaches, leading coaches to, for example, I brought in numerous college coaches from all divisions for coaches clinics and for player coaches clinics and for player clinics. People came. I was fortunate. I knew people. I went to all the meetings forever, the national meetings. We had Tony Seaman from Penn. We had Bob Scott, who had retired from Hopkins. We had, trying to think of all of them. Jerry Schmidt, we had from Princeton at that point. Dave Urich from Hobart, who ended up winning 10 consecutive national championships, and he went on to Georgetown. Mort LaPointe from Bowdoin, of course, Rich Kimball from Michigan State, several times. I brought in anyone who would come. I remember calling Carl Runk at Towson, and Carl said, "I don't fly. I will not fly. I'm afraid of flying." And I said, "So how do I get you here?" He said, "Send me some country western tapes and I will drive up." And he did. Just so many people, and my point was, to try and let coaches see, not that I knew, but let's have the best in the country come and see Michigan lacrosse. And that started to get kids noticed. That made a huge difference.
Did the Cranbrook Jamboree start under you, or was that before you?
No, it started after me. I think John Giampetroni probably had a big hand in that. Okay. And of course, John, has been a mentor. I've been his mentor, but he's, he keeps me abreast of what's going on in Michigan lacrosse. I think, I guess other things I would tell you that when I first got to Michigan, maybe the story of how I got the job, I was not going to be the head coach. I got hired in June because somebody left. And Jim DeCamp was the name of the guy who was going to be the head coach. And it got to be end of, I guess, maybe early December, which was when the national coaches meeting was. And I taught until, and coached till 6:00 on Saturday afternoon or Friday afternoon, drove to Maryland, went to the meeting, went to 3 days of meetings, drove all night to get back in time for school on Monday to teach. And Jim DeCamp said, "Where have you been?" And I told him. He said, "Well, dang, I shouldn't be the coach. You should be the coach. You care a lot more than I do." And Jim resigned. I became the coach. Jim wouldn't even help me coach. I had no assistant, no JV, and I became the coach. That was fun. That, I was working in a dorm, so I got to know kids well, and was coaching 3 sports. Ended up, as things progressed, moments like there was a lot of serious rivalry as there is now. Teams, yeah, go ahead.
We keep hearing I didn't get back to Michigan from California until probably 92, 3 or 4, somewhere in there, and got involved in lacrosse here, and had been involved in the West Coast. And then, because I grew up a Canadian box player, at any rate, I keep hearing the stories of the golden era of lacrosse in that 80s. Ebert still has a 7th and 8th grade championship on his resume from winning it in those days. And I kind of point out to him that there's 140 some odd teams now playing. And I'm not saying that there wasn't good teams in those days, but being, I was 6th place. Well, there were only 6 teams in the state. It doesn't, right. You've seen lacrosse in Denver. You've seen lacrosse many places else. It was no better in the 80s than it was now. There's as many good teams now as there was then. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when I first got there, some of the best teams, and sorry, Ron Hebert, an apology to you, but I don't agree. And we really rarely agreed, even though we coached in camps all the time together. When I first got there, the teams that had been the best, one was Lance Cruz, and the other, Lance Cruz North, I think it was. And then there was Lance Cruz, and Roger Bunton took over, I think, and did a remarkable job. Roger, there's no one. The two people in Michigan lacrosse who I believe worked the hardest were Mike Jolly and Roger Burton. I think it was Roger Burton. I'm pretty sure that was Bunton. Roger Bunton. Yes, yeah. Yes. And the programs had dropped. And teams like Rice and Catholic Central and Cranbrook and some others emerged. But no, it was, I can tell you, I've watched some Michigan lacrosse live and online. I went down to Florida 4 years to help coach when Matthew Giampetroni was there. I met John down there and helped coach Cranbrook, and I was blessed that those guys, the brothers allowed me to come. I mean, think about allowing some guy who was pretty good as a coach at Cranbrook, and he's coming down as the consultant, right? No, I think lacrosse is every bit as good now and better.
I've mentioned this story a couple of times through this series, and I don't want to be redundant, but I had a chance to ask Don Lutz. I said, you come from Ohio University, you're starting a lacrosse program, start from scratch. Does it dawn on you at some point while you're formulating these plans that there's nobody to play because you're the only team? And he says it never dawned on him. He says he figured we'd end up playing adult teams and college teams and club teams. And so the joke was, can you imagine taking that discussion? And I've said this a couple times during the interviews. Can you imagine having that discussion with your athletic director today, of going back and saying, oh, by the way, we're going to play a bunch of men on Thursday night, and I can't imagine what the liability insurance would cost the school district, right? It's not a reasonable discussion.
I will say Don was doing a great job then. The fact is there were, several teams, were at the top, but the fact is there were some very, very good teams and some very good coaches. I'm going to tell you a couple anecdotal moments to show you how different lacrosse is. And rules have changed dramatically, not just liability insurance or athletic directors, but in those years, for example, there was no limit to the number of long sticks. I played 8 long sticks on rides. And when I first started doing it, people were looking at me like I'm crazy. Right. I had one short stick behind the goal, which would keep the ball from going back and forth behind the goal. The rest were pressing. Okay. Right. And when that first happened, we were just killing people. They had no clue. Then I remember this was against Roger Bunton, and this was one of my favorite moments. He had a really good team. By comparison scores, we were going to lose by quite a bit. And they had put a defensive head of a stick that was kind of halfway between the width of a goalie stick and a regular stick. So it was extra large, okay? I played 2 goalies, a lefty and a righty. 2 goalies, and played a 5-man zone, okay? And my second goalie, came out of the goal after the ball was cleared, but when it came down, we played a 5-man zone, and we smoked them. And he called, the referees. He said to the referees, "This is not legal. This can't be legal." It was. There was nothing in the rules that said otherwise. And the fact is, we did a number of things or other things that were all, by the rules. Right. It was one of my favorite moments of all time. And the kids still talk about it. I still have a few kids that played on that game that just went, "Coach, that was the most inspirational thing imaginable." Go ahead.
When I coached at Michigan State my first couple of years, the rules were changing with women. So a team would go into a zone. So I would have one of my young ladies come over and stand next to me here. We're up 3 goals. Come over and stand here. So the clock would run, and There's no possession. And then the other women coaches would look at me and go, "Well, what is that?" I said, "I got the ball. I got the lead. If you're not going to come out of your zone to attack me," I said, "Have you ever heard of Dean Smith's 4 corners?"
Yeah, right.
And I would get screamed at the end of the game because that's not lacrosse. That's not the way we play. I said, "It's called strategy." "Well, it's stupid." I said, "Well, I held the ball for the last 17 minutes and it won the game." So one-man strategy is you can't play basketball. You can't put basketball strategy into these kinds of things. So it's just, I get that point. But the nickel league, up until probably 10 years ago, you could play as many poles as you wanted. And when games at the exchange of goals, as games became 4 hours long, somebody finally decided that they needed to change that things, and rules have changed a lot over the last 15 years towards the
Sure,
sport,
the
and not usually towards
substitution
safety.
rules changed that.
Yeah, and that's a good
Substitution rules made that, not acceptable. I think another, that reminds me of another moment. We used to play teams up in Ontario too. And so what would happen, we'd play international rules. And so there's no substitution the way, the whistle blows and so on. That was before those rules changed. And as a result, we probably played much faster than a lot of other teams, which actually got us a lot of goals. We had a lot of end line plays, which teams didn't have at that point. And there were a number of things that happened. We were just quicker. And then another rule that very few people who are going to see this even know, for I want to say it was 2 years, there was a face-off circle about the size of the crease. No one was allowed in the circle. And it happened in college too. But no one was allowed in the circle except the two face-off guys. You could reach your stick into it, but you couldn't enter it.
Right.
And what it was doing was, what was happening was kids were just coming in. They just put a goon on the wing and come in and crush the face-off guy.
Right.
And that rule ended up being changed.
Right.
But we had a game where we were behind Western Reserve Academy by 11 goals at half. It was 12-1. And because of the face-off rule, I pulled my guys together and I said, all right, we are not, hard to believe, but we ended up winning every face-off in the second half because of the face-off circle. And what we did with keeping our face-off guy holding the ball in the circle until he won it.
Wow.
And we ended up winning 17-16.
Must have drove the other coach nuts.
Skip Flanagan and I go way, way back, and we're good friends, actually. But Flanagan never beat us, never won against Cranbrook in 10 years. Wow. And we went down there one year. You talk about what you used to do, and where you take kids. We'd go down to the Midwest games, and we'd sleep on the wrestling floor at Western Reserve. This is quote unquote the rich Cranbrook prep kids. We'd sleep on the floor in sleeping bags. We took our own food down in coolers, drove down in a couple of vans. And the first time, and this John Giampetroni probably could tell you this, we beat Reserve, and he'd recruited a bunch of kids from Maryland, a bunch, like some, sophomores and juniors who had won significant awards. And we ended up beating him, I want to say, by 2 goals. And Skip introduced me, because we had dinner afterwards. He introduced me to his goalie coach, his midfield coach, his offensive coach, his defensive coach, and he's the head coach. And Giampetroni comes up and says, well, I'd like you to meet our head coach, our assistant coach, our offensive coach, our defensive coach, our goalie coach. This is Mr. Graesser. And Flanagan never forgave me for that. And actually, that reminds me of one more thing about, I think an inflection point, to be honest with you, in how Michigan lacrosse, one, got more recognition nationally, but also we in the beginning, we couldn't compete with the teams Worthington, Arlington, Swickley in the Midwest. And I started a box league in the winter. And the league, I believe, was different in this. The other thing was the rivalries were so intense that even if kids were friends, it was hard. It was difficult to have a well-played sportsman-like game. Referees weren't quite as sophisticated and as competent as perhaps now. And so the box league was, there were 9 kids on a team. Okay, maybe it was 10. But no more than 3 kids could be from any one school.
Oh, okay.
Therefore, you're playing with Catholic Central and
Right.
Rice and Lance Cruz kids. You get to be really good friends. And it was always a Sunday, so kids playing other sports could play. It was box, just 5-on-5 and goalie. It was wonderful. And 2 years later, Michigan started beating all of the Midwest teams on a consistent basis. I think that once we started doing that, then now we started getting recognized more and more by national coaches, by, Michigan's got some great players.
Let me ask you a question. This goes back to another conversation we've been having with some of the guys who are real box guys. I was a hockey player who grew up playing box because I was lazy and that's what you had to do in the summertime. But there's a lot of guys that are hanging out their shingles now that say that they're box coaches, and they're really teaching field lacrosse inside a small space. So when you start a box league in those days, do you have somebody that understands the game, or was it just roll the ball out in a confined space?
No, we did not. We did not have someone who really understood the game. My contention was two things that I was trying to accomplish, and I'm the one who ran the league, and it cost the kids exactly what the ice would have cost, right?
Right.
Because we played it in a hockey rink, and in hockey time. So there are some rinks that just didn't run in the winter, so that's the rink we'd hire.
Right.
And my contention was that we needed to have kids get to know each other better. And in a confined space, you're going to learn to protect your stick better. You're going to learn closer passing. And I can't even, the referees we had were more, it wasn't, it was so much different that we didn't kill each other. So no, we didn't. I mean, I didn't even learn a great deal about box lacrosse, to be honest, until probably when I was back in Denver after Michigan. And then I started connecting with some box people. And then in particular, Jamie Monroe, who was at Denver University, was doing a lot of that stuff. Jamie became an assistant for me. I was teaching his son in middle school and coaching him. And no, that's a great question, though. And I don't know what we would have done. And I used to coach a number of Native American kids who played box, and they'd foul out before the first quarter was over. It was like they'd get in, they'd get 5 slashing penalties, and they're gone.
Yeah, and I only illustrate the point because I think it's important the kids play lacrosse in any time, whether it's tennis balls or just to play to get their stick skills down. I've been sort of questioning those guys who are telling these kids who are paying lots of money to learn box skills when they're being taught field skills inside a rink. And there is a difference in that approach. And again, maybe I'm a purist,
Absolutely.
but I think it's something that I think has to be differentiated. I want as many kids to play as possible, but don't masquerade as a box coach if you've never picked up a stick or saw a box game in your life. Is I think a fair point to make.
Well, I do believe that I agree with you heartily, and in particular because box skills translate, to be sure, and look at what's happened to the world games. Okay, how is it that the Canadians are beating us? Because they are much better in close quarters.
Yeah.
And why are all these Canadian kids doing so well in the field game? Because they got so much more space, they don't know what to do with it.
Well, in the early days for me of coaching field lacrosse, it never dawned on me that we didn't play with one hand and practice one-handed skills. That never dawned on me that you didn't do those things, and you'd end up on a staff with somebody that's East Coast trained, and we'd actually physically work on picking a ground ball up one hand in the open field because it's just faster. And these guys would almost like a heretic because you got to pick up with two hands every time. I said, all I'm going to tell you is if you miss it one-handed, it's embarrassing. But other than that,
yes.
If I want to try to get down if I get down the field quicker, what difference does it make how I do it? So
well, and again, you start looking at things like behind the back passes, same kind of thing. I mean, talk about heresy. If I had done that when I was in high school, I suspect I would have been benched for the rest of the season.
Yeah. Well, it's the hockey issue. In my day, you better put your stick on the ice and keep it there and use it like a rudder.
Right.
Because if the stick comes off the ice, and I mean, I watch goalies now, the kid will flop and they'll go over the shoulder. The kid will flop, they'll go over the shoulder. The kid will flop. Why don't you stand up a little bit and make them go left or right? You got more room, especially with the pad you have. And
sure,
they still flop. Well, anyway, you can't change directions when you're on the ground. You can't change directions when you're in the air. I mean, it's pretty simple. So
yes, yeah.
You have a great affinity for the American native part of this game. And was that picked up from East Coast, or is that something that maybe you picked up from Cranbrook? Because I know you talked a little bit about having the Canadian influence here in Michigan.
I think two things. I think part of it was because when I first started coaching and teaching, I was teaching Native American kids. number of kids from the Mohawk Reservation. And I think, first of all, they taught me, I'll be honest, I think in the first 3 years of teaching Native American kids, I learned more about me than I did in the next 41 as a teacher, because they never criticized or judged, but they asked, how come you do that? And that's all they'd say. And so I had grown up a specific way. And then a couple of my kids, a couple of my former students, their fathers were the ones who were carving the first lacrosse sticks, the wooden ones. They were making them out of hickory. And I, my first, even through Vermont Academy, my first 5-6 years, I fixed every stick. I fiberglassed them. I rebuilt gut walls. I restrung the leather thongs. When the first, two anecdotal things, I guess, when the first metal sticks came in, they were very heavy. And I got sent one and asked if I would use it, on my program. I think it came through Bob Scott at Hopkins. And it was like, gosh, you hit a kid with that and he'd move sideways. And they were judging it. And then I got very much involved with Jimmy D'Arcangelo, who was working for Backrack Raisin then. And Jimmy was the first 3-time World Cup or World Team member ever. I don't know how many there are now, but he played in 3 consecutive World Games. And Jimmy called me and said, there's a special program at Wayne State University. Can I come up and stay with you? And he stayed with me for 2 weeks. And Wayne State was doing compression tests on football helmets. And Jimmy came up and they started, Backrack Raisin was going to make a lacrosse helmet. And they started doing compression tests to see what happens with a lacrosse ball when it hits or a stick when it hits a helmet. And Jimmy would come home after these tests every day. It was awesome. I mean, I got to see what a lacrosse ball looked like going partway into a helmet, what a stick looked like when you whacked it. And that's when I got Jimmy to do a coaching clinic and a player clinic while he was up there.
Did that experience change your thoughts on safety?
Absolutely. It's the first time I ever thought about it. But see, that's when sticks, because of how sticks had changed, when the ball started to be thrown significantly harder, right, and shot, and therefore, until it happens to you, till some kid gets hit and something happens, I don't. In those days, we didn't have trainers. We didn't have that kind of awareness by any stretch that we have now, which is a good thing. I mean, I didn't even see an athletic trainer until I was halfway through the experience at Cranbrook.
You're a boarding school kid who eventually taught your career in boarding schools, and it sounds like the biggest influence you had in your life in reverence to this game came from 3 years with some Indian kids who maybe didn't have the educational backgrounds that you might have had. That's pretty significant. And something you've carried for your life. I mean, that says a lot, doesn't it?
I can't remember I'm embarrassed. I can't think of the author of the book, The Spirit in the Stick. Yeah. But it's a great book. And it incorporates a great deal of lacrosse history. And I actually made that required reading for a number of my teams over the course of time. I said, you may not play for me until you read it.
Right here.
Okay. Yeah, sure. That's a great one too. Yeah. Yeah. No, I've still got a first edition signed by Bobby Scott, who was one of the first lacrosse book, I think, of any significance that was ever written. And so I appreciate that. One other thing I guess I'd love to say is that I spent a lot of energy. We used to drive down to Maryland to play games. We used to drive to Florida to play games. In those years, the travel bans were different in high school lacrosse. And one of my favorite moments was, which I think put us on the map, to be honest with you, Cranbrook. We went down to Florida to play in what was called the Royal Palms tournament. And we played a team from Maryland called Gonzaga. And Gonzaga was ranked 8th in the country as we're going in to play this game. And we ended up beating them significantly. And the coach asked, he said, "Do they have lacrosse in Michigan?" And I said, "Oh yeah, we're okay." I think we beat him by 7 goals or something. And he kept his team out on the field for 3 hours after that in the heat running because he was so embarrassed. Now, they don't call it a game because although we played it with referees and so on, it was not a game.
Right.
They didn't list it on their schedule, but it helped us, and playing teams like Gilman and St. Paul's and so on in Maryland helped us a great deal too.
So you were at Cranbrook until 91, is that right?
No, 79 to 89.
89. Okay.
Yeah.
So then back to Denver, is that where you went from there?
Yes, then back to Denver and coached there until I retired 2000 and I don't know, maybe about 7 years ago. I got to turn something off here. And then in my last 5 years, I lost my wife to cancer. And my wife said before she died, "Listen, you need to do something with your life besides just teach." And I got hired by the Denver Outlaws to coach as the offensive coordinator. Did that for 5 years. Never won the championship. We got to the semifinals, I think, 4 times. What I've discovered, for those of you who are high school coaches, I can't say I didn't learn a lot coaching, but most of the kids were between 22 and 30. And in point of fact, I said exactly the same things to them as I said to my high school kids. It was like, how can you not, for example, count to 3 when you cross midfield? To know that you're not offsides. Simple things that, that translate very easily to the professional game. It was a wonderful experience. And, coaching in Mile High and traveling around the country was great.
One of the guys we interviewed for the Michigan Lacrosse Review was Bill Wolford, who's a friend of mine. Who's
Sure.
Bill
was down at Worthington.
Yeah.
Billy was down at the Worthington when I was coaching.
Yeah. Well, Billy and I have been friends for 25 years, and he was on Bear Davis's staff for the Ohio Machine. And so one of the things we talked about during the interview was, what's it like going from a high school field on Friday night to a college, or in this case, a professional field on Saturday? Was there any reservations in thinking about it? No matter how much you think you have confidence in your ability, there has to be a few butterflies going into that next experience. And I always think of a freshman college football player coming out and having been a stud in high school. Now he's on the stand, he's at Michigan or Michigan State. There's a transition there that takes some time and understanding. And he said, he did first couple days is the same thing, but he basically made the same point you did. I'm a teacher. I teach. And I learned some things, and you may change your approach to a 30-year-old man with 3 kids than you do to a 17-year-old high school kid, but
right. Teaching
is teaching. And so the experience for that, you obviously have to be pretty pleased, I would think, that the MLL and the PLL have merged in the last month. Is that something that?
Yes.
That
absolutely.
I think
absolutely.
Because now I think you can have an indoor season and an outdoor season and have better players.
Yes, I think. It's in some ways it's like any other sport. Once you expand a little bit, you realize there's so many good players out there. It's like now Michigan, like Connecticut, as you mentioned earlier, or like Denver. Bill Tierney goes out, and all of a sudden there's a lot of Denver kids playing for the University of Denver. The fact is, kids are kids, and it doesn't matter. California, I think of the number of teams that the kids didn't have a chance because people didn't think they were good enough. They are great.
You spent a good portion of your career in the mountains. Was the love of mountains? Connecticut's not exactly known for, large peaks. So my question to you is your time in Vermont, is that where the love of mountains came from?
I think more it was a career situation. Lennox School had closed. The headmaster at Vermont Academy said, "Would you come up and run our lacrosse program?" And that's when I first started to love the mountains, I think. But then coming out to Colorado, anyone who's been here knows, I lived in Denver. We actually just moved 2 months ago outside of Denver to Bailey, which is an hour outside of Denver. I live in a 675-foot cabin that's nice, but it's 30 feet from the South Fork of the North Platte River.
Oh,
It's,
oh,
some fly fishing, and I've got a view out the window of some mountains. It's, it's nice.
I spent a lot of time and lived in Lake Placid. So
Okay.
when you come west, when you don't have when the trees go all the way to the top of the mountain at 7,000, and the trees don't even start until 7,000. There, the peaks go from there. Mountain's a mountain, but there's nothing quite like. I love the water, obviously, but it's a different place.
Right.
I guess the one question. I'm terribly sorry to hear about your wife, and that's just one of those things that happens in life. But kids, any kids?
Yes, I have 2 kids. I have a daughter who's a doctor and a son who is actually living off the grid with his wife and 2 kids in North Carolina, totally off the grid.
Were either one of them lacrosse players?
Yes, my daughter played and my son played. They both played. I won't say they were spectacular, but they both played and they loved the game. My son was a coach for a long time till he moved off the grid, and now he's homeschooling the kids. So
That's cool.
I appreciate asking.
You spend a lot of time wherever you've been doing a lot of devotion to the sport and changing some of the rules for our Hall of Fame this year for criteria. We wanted to have a little more understanding, and part of the service to your community is one thing, but then service to the sport is really different. And every one of the nice threads about this interview process has been, it's a different guy in a different town with a pickup truck going around the community picking up sticks or garbage or cans or whatever, but it's the one guy in that one town, and you were that one guy in the town you've been in. And I think that's the thread that holds us all together to build this pyramid. And talk a little bit about your devotion to that. And I mean, I say that because a lot of people have told me how much you did off the map to the devotion to the sport, and I think that's what they respect you the most for. And I think it says all you need to say about you.
Well, thank you. I'm honored that other people see it. I think, I think it goes back to my roots at Lennox School, where not to be served, but to served was the motto. And I think that I have always loved the game of lacrosse because you don't have to be big. You don't have, and I was, good grief. I was 146 pounds and 5'7" as a player and successful. And, one of my mottos has always been ashes to ashes, dust to dust, what the big man can't do, the little man must. And in point of fact, when you think about how it extends, I'll think about things in Michigan where we tried very hard to, Rich Kimball was a big part of that too, but we tried very hard to make sure it was available for all kids. Again, I go back to the Will Rogers quote, lead your life by example, and kids can go and do that. And lacrosse, there was no, gosh, I'm going to be a professional lacrosse player. Well, now you can be, but that's a very small number of people.
Yes.
And it was an amateur circumstance, I believe.
Right.
I can remember doing things, going down and doing clinics all over the state of Michigan. I remember going out to Holland to do clinic, as the quote unquote lead speaker or whatever, Lansing a couple of times, other places, even down into Ohio. I remember going to Toledo to do one. And in point of fact, I remember in Colorado, now there's this City Lax is a big program in Denver now, where disadvantaged kids, a lot of them are African-American kids, are getting head starts. And I can remember going down to parks with equipment on a Saturday and Sunday. I don't even know where I got kids, but I'd send out word and kids would show up and start to play. And, that's part of why, people like Bill Tierney and Matt Brown and others might have nice things to say about me. I've always believed that lacrosse, there's a historical perspective. There's a, Begataway was about camaraderie and war in a sense. but people could coexist and do things what I would think are the right way. And lacrosse has always been that for me. And, and as you mentioned to me earlier, you do a lot of community service things. I always tried to do that. My kids always had to earn money. We always earned the money to do our traveling trips for scholarship kids and coaches, so that anyone could go. And that's always been sort of a motto. So I appreciate that somebody even recognizes that. I think it's the right way to go, and that's just my own personal perspective. My time in Michigan was remarkable.
I used to do a lot of community service work just to build some bridges where I have my big mouth would get me in trouble from opening them. So I have to go back and do the work to rebuild the reputation. I say that jokingly. Tom, this has been a real pleasure for me to have a chance to talk to you. I know what you've meant to the sport. I know what you've meant to the guys here. And Matt Brown was, and I mentioned earlier, I said something about Mike Murphy. He's on the Chaos where, anyway, Matt's build attorney. They're just terrific guys, and they have the utmost respect for what you've done. And I just wanted to tell you, I appreciate all the work you've done, and it's been really fun getting to know you a little bit. And I really appreciate you sitting down and talking with us.
Well, two quick things, if I could. One,
absolutely.
I hope our paths cross again, and I thank you I'm honored that you've taken the time to do this. And I'm going to leave you with a Mark Twain quote.
Okay.
You can ponder this as you wish.
All right.
It's better to keep your mouth shut and appear stupid than to open it and remove all doubt. I have removed all doubt. Thank you.
And I would reverse it and leave you with a Will Rogers quote, which was, "You never get smart talking." Which you think about that one is there's some truth to that. Again, appreciate your time and thanks.